Well, the first ancestor who came over to this country was a man named Simpson Thorman. And he grew up in a little town in Bavaria. It was not Germany yet. You know, there was no Germany until 1870. And back in the early part of the 1800s, he lived in a town. The town had about 900 people living in it, of whom about 200 were Jews. And there were a lot of restrictions on Jews and how they could live. They were limited on number of marriages and all kinds of things. So he and two boys, three of them 18-year-old kids, decided to set out for the New World. And they did. And that's quite a journey when you think of it, because they were never going to see anybody again from the old town. They were going to have to travel over an ocean that the dimensions of which were not as well known as today. And they were going to go into a new world that people talked about, but nobody knew very much about. And so the three boys came over. And we're not sure of everything they did. When did they leave? We think sometime around 1829 or 1830. And somewhere around 1832, they came through Cleveland, as best we can tell. And they continued on out west as far as a little town in Missouri, got all the way out there. And then, for some unknown reason, they split. And one of them went down to St. Louis and settled and left a prominent family down there. Another went back to Indiana, and we know very little about him. And my great-great-grandfather, Simpson Thorman, came back to Cleveland and settled down here. And that was in 1837. Now, what he'd been doing for the 5 and 6 and 7 years, we're not sure, other than roaming the country out to Missouri and then coming back here. He is considered the first Jewish settler in the city. The city had about 5,000 people in that time. And he was the first Jewish settler. Now, he wasn't the first Jewish person to ever be in the town. There was a doctor who was here at the time he came, who used to sort of come in from New York and spent time in Cleveland, but then he left the next year and never appeared again. So he's not considered a settler. And there was another Jewish person who lived way out in what today we might consider the outskirts of Cleveland, but in those days was way far out, another city virtually. So Simpson gets credit for being the first Jewish settler. That was 1837. We think he got rather lonely because he wrote a letter back to Unsleben, Bavaria, and said how wonderful everything was here. And in 1839, there arrived 17 more people, Jewish people, from Unsleben, who settled in Cleveland and came here because of his inspiration. And that was the beginning of the Jewish community of Cleveland, because a community doesn't begin with one person. It begins with enough people to form a religious institution and to have what they call a minyan in Jewish life. And those people came over, and they came with a blessing from their rabbi in Unsleben, who told them, "You are going to a wonderful new world. Don't neglect your religion, don't forget your religion." And there's a famous document that was brought with them called the Alsbacher document that came over here in 1839. So Simpson started the whole thing, really. And in the group that came over in 1839 was a wife for him named Regina Klein, and he married her right after he came here. They had 11 children. So despite the fact that he traveled west in the fur and hide business, traded with the Indians, furs and hides, set up a shop downtown where he sold furs and hides, he must have got home fairly frequently because he had these 11 children, 8 of whom grew up to adulthood. So there were a lot of Thormans around. And his first child was the first Jewish child born in Cleveland. Now, Simpson, there were many things about his life, and I can't go into every detail of it, but he, I told you the business he was in. He also had a place, a house downtown, we know where it was, and then there was a epidemic, and he had to move to another place, which was by Orange Avenue, what's now Orange Avenue. In fact, they called it Thorman Crossing at one time, we found out. He went on also to be one of the founders of the Euclid Avenue Temple. He was involved in almost everything in the city at the time, and he became, in the Civil War days in 1965 and 6, I believe it was, he was a city councilman for the city of Cleveland, and the first Jewish city councilman ever. So he had an interesting career, and we're still trying to dig up more information to get all the details of what he did during his life. But his first child, Elizabeth Thorman, went on to marry a man named Kaufman Hayes. Kaufman Hayes had come over here in 1852 from a place called Stormdorf, Germany. And for much of the same reasons that the other boys, there was a lot of problems for Jewish people living in Europe. And Kaufman arrived here absolutely penniless, with nothing in his pocket. Went on to become, one might say, the leading Jewish citizen of the late 1800s in the city. He had a business career where he and a group of prominent Clevelanders started and were very involved in a bank that was a predecessor to the National City Bank. I should remember the name of it, but it escapes me right this minute. He was in the fabric business. He owned the Cleveland Worsted Mills at the time, which was a very large and profitable business. He was he belonged to Tifereth Israel congregation and was a chair of the board at one time of that, and certainly involved in it, and was involved in many, many things throughout the city. He was truly a leading citizen. And one of the interesting stories is that somewhere, I think it was in the 1880s, but I may be off in my timing, we haven't established exactly when, the treasurer of the city of Cleveland absconded with funds and left the city in very difficult financial circumstances. And the mayor of the city at the time asked him to come in and straighten out the city finances and restore it to stability, which he did. So he played a rather major part in getting the city back on a good financial footing. And as I say, was involved in many things in the city and led a very productive life. He had 4 daughters. He and Elizabeth Thorman. They had 4 daughters. One of those daughters was named Frances, and she was my grandmother. she married Rabbi Moses Gries, who came from Rahway, New Jersey, where he had grown up, a town not too far from Newark. And he arrived here. Well, he was rather an amazing person himself, I've learned. For one thing, he went to college at the age of 13, sort of unusual. And he went to Hebrew Union College. And he graduated high school at the same time he was going to Hebrew Union College, and then went on to college. So he was doing a double thing, but by the time he was like 20, he'd done it all and was in the rabbinate. And he had a place with a temple down in Tennessee for 4 years, and then in 1892 he was attracted to Cleveland. And the congregation was Tifereth Israel, which, as you know, is one of the big Reform. There are only two big Reform temples, Cleveland, and that was one of them. And Rabbi Gries came here as a young fella in his early 20s to take over this congregation, which existed downtown. And of course, every rabbi has to build their new temple, you know that. So he built his new temple on 55th Street in the early 1890s. And that building still stands. It's now a church. It's on 55th Street, north, fairly far north toward Orange Avenue. But it still exists there. I've been in the building and seen it. Well, he spent 25 years in the rabbinate. And he was one of the great leaders nationally of classical Reform Judaism. And the idea of classical Reform Judaism, the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th, was that you had to adapt yourself to America. And so that meant you didn't hold your services on Saturday because people worked on Saturday, and any job you wanted was a 6-day job where you worked on Saturday. So his services were on Sunday. And they were open services and attended by a population all around, many of them non-Jewish. And he was quite an orator, and I've read a lot of his orations. And he also was a part of starting many of the organizations that started in Cleveland during the period that he was here from 1892 till 1918. He left the rabbinate in 1917, and he died the next year. Why he left the rabbinate, we're not sure, whether he had a premonition of his illness or other reasons we never established. Before he left, though, he was the one who selected Abba Hillel Silver to be his successor. And Abba, many years later, was succeeded by his son Daniel. And that temple, Tifereth Israel, also had only those three rabbis for almost 100 years, from 1892 till Daniel died, I think, in the 1980s, which was a pretty long reign. He was one of the original trustees of the Jewish Federation, which was started during that time, and also of all kinds of civic activities that took place in Cleveland during what was a very progressive era for Cleveland in the period of the 1890s and up to the First World War, 1915 Many of our institutions were started in those days. And he was a major part of Cleveland at that time. One other story to tell you, he was also at one point the chairman of the Organization of Reform Judaism nationally. And the interesting part of that is that Tifereth Israel is the only temple that has ever had 3 rabbis elected to that position. The first was Moses Gries, the second was Ava Silver, and Rabbi Block, who is the current head of Tifereth Israel, is taking over that position, I think, within the next 6 months or a year, and will be the 3rd rabbi from that temple. And he will be taking it over exactly on the 100th anniversary of when Rabbi Gries was the head of the national group of Reform Judaism. He had, at the time he left in 1918, he had built the temple to, I believe, the largest Sunday school class that ever existed anywhere in the country. And he had built it into all kinds of things that were new and different, and was very well recognized as a major leader in the religious movement, as well as in all kinds of things in Cleveland. Rabbi Gries and Francis had 2 children, 2 boys, the oldest of which was my father, who was Robert Gries, called Bob Gries, and I'll come to him a little bit later, because he married a lady, and we'll go back to her father now, because my other grandfather at the time was also a very major part of Cleveland. His name was Nathan Dalby. Nathan Dalby was born in 1873. His mother died in childbirth when he was born, so he never had a mother. His father was a itinerant salesman who really couldn't make a living and support a family without a wife, and so he grew up with his aunts. His father had fought in the Civil War with the Ohio Regiment. He was just an 18-year-old private at the time, but he had been in the Northern Army in the Civil War. But N.L. Dalby grew up with nothing. He got through 8th grade, and then he had to quit school and go to work. So he never went beyond 8th grade in his education. He went to work, and in his late teens was in the shoe business. And he teamed with an older man named Strauss, and they had a shoe store down on Ontario Street called Dalby and Strauss. And there were 2 things different about it from other shoe stores. The major thing was that my grandfather did not believe in bargaining for the price. And in those days, everybody bargained for the price. And my grandfather said no. He said, here is the price. If you can find anything better, then go buy it. He says, but go look, and then you'll come back to us. And that was unheard of in those days. He also believed in advertising, which was not done very much in those days. His older partner, Strauss, didn't necessarily agree with some of these things, so eventually he was able to buy him out. And he had a successful shoe business. In I think it was 1901 or 1902, he married a lady named Bessie Bram, B-R-A-H-A-M. Her father, Louis Bram, was English. The rest of the family all came from the German area or the Austro-Hungarian area. It was part of Germany, but Louis Bram came from England. And Bessie Bram had an interesting, we'll sidelight a minute, she had an interesting part of her early life. She was born in 1880 in Leadville, Colorado, during the silver boom days. And she grew up in the Denver area after the silver boom ended, was in Denver. And I have, in fact, copies of her 1898 high school graduation, you know, folders and all those kind of things, and even part of her wedding dress. She had a sister, and her sister married David May, who was a young fellow from Connecticut who had asthma, and they told him to go west. He went west. He went to Leadville, Colorado, and he opened a store called D. May and Sons. That was the beginning of May department stores, which for the next 100 years was a large department store chain. So David May started that, and my grandmother was his niece. And her husband, her father, worked with David May in the early stages of the May Company. It started in the silver boom days in Leadville, Colorado. When the silver boom ended, moved to Denver and opened a store. Then bought stores in the 1890s in St. Louis, the famous bar stores, or two stores, and they merged them together. And then in 1899, they opened a store in Cleveland. They bought a place called the Hull and Dutton Company, and they changed the name to May Company. It was just a fairly small store. In those days, a department store was a store of departments. You didn't own many of them. Many of them were leased and run that way. And my grandfather marries Bessie, and he takes over the shoe concession in the then May Company in 1901 or 2. Well, a couple of years later, I'm told it was the only department making any money in the store, and they asked him to take over the whole store. And a very interesting thing happened then, too. And we go back to Nathan Dalby now. Here was a guy brought up dirt poor, no money at all. Had some initial success in the shoe business, but still was quite poor. And all of a sudden, he's asked to take over this department store at the time, and offered a very, what at that time was a very substantial salary. We're not sure whether it was 20, 25, 30,000, but in 1902, that was a lot of money. And he said no. He said, I don't want a salary. He said, I want 10% of the profits, and if there are no profits, I don't make any money. That took guts. And they gave it to him. Fast forward 20 years into the 1920s, and he was making as much as any retailer in the United States. He was making more than Marshall Field or J.L. Hudson or Strauss, who was running Macy's. And I have all the clippings from that era because he had the guts to say, no, give me a percentage of the profits, reasonable percentage, and stuck with it all his life. That's the only contract he had. 10% of the profits to run the store. And eventually he reduced it to 9%, and then when he stopped working full time, which meant all the time, he took himself off the payroll totally after the Second War because he wasn't going to work full time. He was going to spend most of his time on philanthropy. But it's an interesting story. And of course, he built the May Company up, and during that time, became a major player in Cleveland. Now, there was one other relative that came into the picture at that time. As I told you, Bessie's sister, or Bessie's mother's sister, married David May. Well, they also had 4 brothers. And one of the brothers was a fellow named Louis Schoenberg. And Louis Schoenberg did very well, made money. He was involved with the May Company. He was involved with the what's called CIT, Commercial Investment Trust, which started in 1907, was started by some of the May family and all that, and they prospered with it. And Louis Schoenberg ended up over in Europe, living in France, in Antibes. And in the First World War, it was very unpopular to have a German name living in France. So he changed his name from Schoenberg to Beaumont. Schoenberg means beautiful mountain in German. Beaumont means beautiful mountain in France, in French. And he changed his name. He also had a boat and became Commodore of his yacht club, and he was then known as Commodore Beaumont. When he died in 1942, he left an estate of $12 million into a foundation, or that part of his estate, into a foundation, which was called the Beaumont Foundation, and played a major part in Cleveland. And he appointed Nathan Dalby to be the principal person, although he operated it with Morton May and others, but he was the principal head of the Beaumont Foundation. The Beaumont Foundation in those days was somewhat like the Gun Foundation. It was the largest single-purpose foundation in the city of Cleveland. And $12 million back in the early 1940s was a lot of money. There was a foundation, Jennings in education, that was large, and Prentice in health, but this was the largest single-purpose foundation ever or existent in Cleveland at the time, and grew to a value of about $30 million in the 1970s. So it supported a broad array of things in the city, and was really one of the big philanthropic drivers in the city. It went out of business in the 1970s because it was set up to be a 35-year foundation and then have to go out of business, which it did. But fortunately, the Gun Foundation had come along and, was a replacement in the Cleveland philanthropic picture. But Beaumont Foundation did a great deal of work, gave away millions and millions of dollars in this town, and helped countless numbers of organizations here. And that was Commodore Beaumont, who started life as Louis Schoenberg. Now, let's go back to Nathan Dobbie. As I said, he was one of the leading philanthropists and certainly one of the leading businessmen in the whole city of Cleveland. And I should mention to you, this is something people don't often realize. There was still a lot of prejudice in town. And my grandfather had a parade of people walk through his office asking for money, which he cheerfully gave them. He was on all kinds of boards, those that accepted Jews in those days, not all of them did. But as an example of what existed in this town, he died in 1964. Until 1968, the Union Club, which is a great institution in this town, a Jewish person could not even eat lunch as a guest of a member in the main dining room. You could go into the private rooms if you were going to a meeting of an organization in Cleveland, but you couldn't even become a guest of a member until 1968. And Jews didn't become members of the Union Club until 1972. And of course, women couldn't even walk in the front door, as you know, I'm sure. Had to go around to the back door. And that wasn't changed till the 1980s. I'm happy to say that all of that is past history. The Union Club has just had a woman president, has African American members on their board of directors, and is open to anyone who is halfway decent citizen of Cleveland and wants to pay the dues.